Most people are operating inside one system, and they don't know there's another one. Not because the information is hidden, but because the system they're inside is the only one they've ever been shown. It has a logic to it, a clear structure, a path that makes sense when you follow it step by step. You learn a skill. You offer that skill to an employer. The employer pays you for your time. You use that income to cover your life. You save what's left. You repeat. That's the labor system. And it works. It produces income. It keeps things moving. It's how the majority of people sustain their lives. And there's nothing wrong with that as a starting point. But it has a ceiling. And that ceiling isn't a failure of effort. It's a structural property of the system itself. Because in the labor system, income is directly attached to presence. You show up, you earn. You stop showing up, you stop earning. There is no version of the labor system where your absence produces more than your presence. The output is always capped by the input, and the input is always your time. Time is the one resource that cannot be scaled. You cannot manufacture more of it. You cannot leverage it past a certain point. You cannot make 1 hour of your time produce what 10 hours would produce. So the labor system, no matter how well you execute inside it, will always be constrained by that fundamental limit. That's not a criticism. That's just the structure of the system. Now there's a second system. Most people are aware it exists in some general sense. They know wealthy people have investments. They know there are assets that produce income. They know money can make money. But knowing it exists and understanding how it actually behaves are different things. The capital system doesn't operate on presence. It operates on position. You don't clock in. You don't trade hours. You don't produce output through effort in the traditional sense. Instead, you hold a position, and that position generates return. Not because you showed up, not because you worked harder than someone else, but because capital, by its nature, produces when deployed correctly, independent of the labor attached to it. That's the structural difference. Labor is linear. You put in, you get out. The relationship between effort and return is direct and proportional. Capital is not linear. Capital compounds. Capital scales. Capital can be in multiple places at once. Capital doesn't get tired. Capital doesn't need a day off. Capital doesn't have a ceiling tied to how many hours exist in a day. These are not personality differences between people. They are structural properties of two different systems. And the reason most people stay in the labor system their entire lives is not because they lack intelligence or discipline or ambition. It's because the labor system is the one they were shown, the one they were prepared for, the one that school, family, and culture all pointed them toward. And the capital system, despite being visible, was never framed as something they were meant to participate in. It was framed as something other people had access to. People with inheritance, people with connections, people who got lucky or started with more. And that framing, whether intentional or not, keeps the two systems feeling like they belong to different categories of people, when in reality, they are just two different structures, with two different sets of rules, two different relationships between effort and return, two different ceilings. One of them is designed to keep you functional. The other is designed to keep growing. Understanding that distinction, clearly, structurally, without emotion, is where the shift begins. Not with a decision yet, not with a move, just with the recognition that two systems exist, and you've only ever been operating in one of them. Capital doesn't behave the way most people expect it to, because most people understand money through the lens of the labor system. In the labor system, Money is a result. You work, money arrives. You stop working, money stops arriving. It's transactional, direct, proportional to effort. So when most people think about having more money, they think about working more, earning more per hour, finding a higher paying role, adding an income stream that still requires their time. All of that is labor thinking applied to a capital problem. And it doesn't cross the gap, because capital doesn't compound through effort, it compounds through position. Here's what that actually means. When capital is deployed, whether into an asset, a business, an ownership stake, a financial instrument, it begins to generate return. That return doesn't require additional input from you. It doesn't require more hours. It doesn't require presence. It requires that the position be held. And while it's held, while you're sleeping, while you're working, while you're doing something else entirely, it's producing, quietly, continuously, without clocking in. That's compounding. And compounding has a property that labor income never develops. It accelerates over time. Labor income is flat in its relationship to time. 1 year of work produces roughly what another year of work produces, adjusted for raises, promotions, incremental growth. But capital compounds geometrically. The return doesn't just add, it multiplies on itself. The base grows. The return grows on the larger base. The base grows again. The return grows again on a larger base still. And this process, left undisturbed over time, produces outcomes that feel disproportionate to the original input. Not because of luck, not because of genius, because of the structural nature of how compounding works. This is why time is the most important variable in capital accumulation, not effort. In the labor system, time is a constraint. There are only so many hours. Your output is capped by how many of them you can sell. In the capital system, time is the engine. The longer capital is deployed in the right position, the more disproportionate the outcome becomes relative to the original input. That's a fundamentally different relationship with time than most people have ever been shown. Most people are taught to sell their time. The capital system teaches something different. Use time. Let it work. Let the position compound while you do other things. There's something else that matters here. Capital doesn't just grow, it generates leverage. Leverage is the ability to produce outcomes larger than your direct effort would create. In the labor system, leverage is limited. You can work harder, you can become more skilled, you can earn more per hour, but there's a ceiling on how much one person's direct effort can produce. Capital removes that ceiling. A capital position doesn't have one person's effort attached to it. It has the productive capacity of whatever it's deployed into. A business that employs people, a property that generates rent, an ownership stake in something that grows, a financial instrument that returns above inflation. None of these require your personal effort to scale. They scale through the system they're part of, through the market they operate in, through the compounding of returns over time. That's what leverage actually is in a financial context. Not borrowed money, not risk, not a shortcut. It's the ability of a position to produce beyond what any single person's labor could create. And that's the structural advantage of capital that most people never get shown clearly. Not as a dream, not as something reserved for a specific type of person, as a mechanical property of how the system works. Labor has a ceiling. Capital compounds past it. Those aren't opinions. They're just how the two systems behave. If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, This channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video. Subscribe. More clarity is coming. If capital compounds the way the last part described, if it scales and leverages and produces without presence, then the obvious question is, why don't more people cross over into it? It's not a simple answer, and it's not one that puts the blame entirely on individuals, because the system that keeps most people in labor isn't accidental. It's structural. It's designed, not through conspiracy, but through the natural self-interest of the systems that benefit from labor participation. The first layer is access. Capital accumulation requires an initial position, something deployed, something held, something that can begin compounding. And to deploy capital, you need capital to begin with. That's the entry problem. For someone inside the labor system, capital feels like a destination, something you arrive at after enough saving, enough discipline, enough time. But by the time most labor participants have saved enough to deploy meaningfully, they're deep into a life structure that demands that capital elsewhere. A mortgage, children, aging parents, the cost of maintaining the life the labor system produces. The surplus that could have become a capital position gets absorbed by the cost of living inside the system. And this isn't irresponsibility. This is the structure of the labor system doing what it was built to do. It consumes its own output. The income you earn gets routed back into the economy through consumption, housing, services, all of which benefit the capital owners on the other side of those transactions. The labor participant earns, the capital participant collects. That's not a moral statement. That's just how the two sides of the system interact. The second layer is visibility. Most people inside the labor system don't have clear models for what capital participation looks like at an entry level. They see the extreme end: hedge funds, real estate empires, venture capital, ownership at a scale that feels completely disconnected from where they are. And so the mental model becomes, capital is for people who already have a lot of it, which makes crossing over feel like it requires a threshold most people will never reach. When in reality, capital participation exists at many levels: small ownership stakes, low-cost index investing, fractional positions in assets that were previously inaccessible. The entry points are more available than the framing suggests, but the framing keeps those entry points invisible to most labor participants. The third layer is incentive. The labor system has a very clear incentive structure. Show up, get paid. Perform, get promoted. Stay, get security. Every reward inside the labor system is tied to continued participation. The system rewards what keeps it running, and what keeps the labor system running is labor. So the rewards, the raises, the promotions, the stability, all flow toward the people who keep showing up, not toward the people quietly building positions outside the system. That's a structural disincentive to crossing over, and it's invisible because the rewards feel real, because they are real inside the labor system. They just don't compound. They don't scale. They don't produce when you stop showing up. That's the final layer: dependency. A life built inside the labor system requires income to maintain. Income requires presence. Presence keeps you inside the system. The longer you stay, the more the life you've built depends on you continuing to stay. The crossing over requires building something alongside that life, slowly, deliberately, with the understanding that the labor system will not reward you for doing it, because it doesn't benefit from you doing it. That's why most people never cross over, not because they couldn't, but because the system they're inside was never designed to point them toward the exit. The shift toward capital doesn't start with a large move. It doesn't start with quitting your job. It doesn't start with a dramatic decision or a sudden access to resources you didn't have before. It starts with a reorientation, a change in what you're building toward, even before you have the means to build it at scale. And that reorientation begins with a single question. What percentage of my financial life is currently working without me? Not what you earn, not what you save, but what portion of your financial position is active, dependent on your presence, and what portion is passive, producing independent of it. For most people inside the labor system, that answer is close to zero. Everything they have requires them to keep showing up. That's not a judgment, that's the starting point. The goal is to move that number, slowly, structurally, over time, in a different direction. To increase the percentage of your financial life that doesn't need you present to keep functioning. The first thing positioning requires is surplus. Capital needs something to deploy, even a small amount, even an amount that feels insignificant. The entry point matters less than the principle. Surplus doesn't mean having extra after everything else. In the labor system, surplus rarely appears naturally. The lifestyle expands to meet the income. The commitments grow as the earnings grow. Creating surplus requires a deliberate decision to not consume everything the labor system produces, to protect a portion of income from the consumption cycle, and to deploy it, however modestly, into a position. That's the first structural move, not dramatic, just the decision to begin at whatever scale is currently available. The second thing positioning requires is patience with compounding, because compounding is invisible at the beginning. A small position producing a small return doesn't feel like progress, so people abandon the position before it has time to develop. They pull the capital back into consumption. They conclude the capital system isn't for them, when in reality, they just didn't stay long enough to see the compounding accelerate. Compounding requires time above all else, not a perfect strategy, not the ideal entry point. Time in the position, consistency in adding to it, patience while it develops. Those three things, sustained over years, produce outcomes that feel disproportionate to the effort involved. Because they are. That's the point. The third thing is a gradual shift in what you prioritize building. Positioning toward capital doesn't mean abandoning income. It means adding a second priority alongside it. What am I building that doesn't require me? And letting that question shape, slowly, where surplus and attention go over time. Consistently enough that 5 years from now, the ratio between active and passive production looks different than today. That's the whole shift, not a revolution, a slow, structural reorientation toward building something that compounds, something that works while you sleep, something that grows while you show up to everything else, something that, over time, begins to reduce how dependent your life is on your continued presence. Not a destination you arrive at, a direction you commit to. And the earlier you commit, at whatever scale is available, the more time you give the compounding to do what it was always going to do. Grow past what effort alone could ever produce. If this shifted something for you, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something.